Good day everyone! So in this video, we're going to discuss Title 3 of the Revised Corporation Code, which is about the Board of Directors in stock corporations or the Board of Trustees in non-stock corporations, as well as the officers. We know that a corporation is an artificial being. Thus, it can perform acts by its name through the duly elected Board of Directors or Trustees and authorized officers. Now, let's talk about the three levels of control in a corporation. The first level of control ay yung Board of Directors or Trustees, which will exercise all corporate powers and yung responsible sa corporate policies and sa paggandak ng business and pagmamanage. The second level of control are the officers who are in charge in executing all the policies from the board and malawak din yung scope of responsibility nila sa business operations. They carry out management functions on a day-to-day basis. The third level of control are the stockholders who have the residual powers when it comes to fundamental and major changes sa corporation, since there are acts na kailangan yung consent or vote nila. According to Section 22, the Board of Directors or Trustees shall exercise the corporate powers, conduct all business, and control all properties of the corporation. In short, they are the governing body of a corporation, and no person such as a stockholder or other officer can sell the assets or properties as well as bind the corporation without authorization by the board. So yung board yung magdedesisyon about done. It's important to note that while the board of directors have the responsibilities I just mentioned, other duly authorized officers can also bind the corporation through their acts, as well as the executive committee, or in some other circumstances, stockholders can directly manage the corporation, provided that these are all stated in the Articles of Incorporation or bylaws, or when they are authorized by the board through a board resolution. Now, the powers of the board ay mula sa Articles of Incorporation or the bylaws, and stockholders can't revoke these powers. They only elect the directors. I mentioned that the stockholders only elect the directors. This is because mas may knowledge yung directors na to sa pagpapatakbo ng business and corporate affairs, so for efficiency, kailangan ng bawat corporation ng governing body. Since they are elected, they are obligated to maintain the fiduciary relationship with the corporation by exercising good faith and diligence in their acts. If may breach of trust, a stockholder may bring actions for the benefit of the corporation through a derivative suit. The director or trustee must be capacitated, of legal age, and in cases of stock corporations, a director must own at least one share of the capital stock of the corporation sa pangalan niya, while in cases of non-stock corporations, only yung mga members yung pwede ma-elect and subject din sa iba pang qualifications stated in the bylaws. Independent directors are elected in cases of corporations vested with public interest, and they must constitute at least 20% of the board. Directors shall be elected for a term of 1 year, and until their successors are elected and qualified, subject to the holdover principle. And ganon din sa trustees, they're elected for a term not exceeding 3 years, and until their successors are elected. Now, I'll discuss the points that were highlighted in Section 23. 1. In the election of directors or trustees, yung mga stockholders or members, they have the right to nominate any director or trustee na qualified, except if the right is reserved for the founder shareholders. 2. Sa meeting for election of directors or trustees, kailangan present yung owners of the majority of the outstanding capital stock in person or through a representative, or members sa non-stock corporation. And they may vote personally or through remote communication or in absentia if authorized lang. Pero pagdating sa corporations vested with public interest, kahit walang provision sa bylaws ng ganon, they can still vote through those modes. 3. Sa stock corporation, yung pagboto is on the basis of shares. So isang share means isang boto nila. Hindi siya based doon sa kung sino lang yung present sa meeting. So kung marami kang hawak na shares, malaki yung part mo in the election. 4. The methods of voting sa stock corporation may be straight voting, which means na yung number of shares of stock is actually multiplied to the number of candidates. So if may 50 shares of stock ka in your name, and there are 3 candidates, you have 150 votes. Pero yung 150 votes will be distributed equally among the directors to be elected. So take 50 votes dun sa 3 candidates. So that's straight voting. It can also be cumulative voting for one candidate. This is only applicable to minority stockholders. So kung kanina, dinistribute equally yung votes nila, dito yung 150 votes will all be voted sa isang director. While in cumulative voting by distribution, pwede rin i-cumulate yung shares. Ang kaibahan lang, one can distribute it however he or she wants. So if meron kang 150 votes and may 5 candidates, pwede mo bigyan ng 50 votes si candidate A, 100 si candidate B, etc. So, pwede niya i-distribute yung votes as he or she sees fit. 5. Sa non-stock corporation, one member may have as many votes kung ilang trustees ang meron. So, if may 10 trustees to be elected, meron kang 10 votes, pero kailangan mo i-distribute, so 1 vote per candidate lang. 6. Yung mga delinquent stock or yung mga due or hindi nabayarang subscription, hindi siya pwedeng iboto. 7. Yung election may be through any manner, pero if na-request ng stockholder or member entitled to vote, it may be conducted by ballot. 8. Of course, yung pinakamaraming boto yung may elect as director or trustee. 9. If hindi nagkaroon ng election, reports must be submitted according to Section 25. Lastly, the directors or trustees, again, must perform the duties within their scope of responsibility. Let's proceed to the Section 24, Corporate Officers. As mentioned earlier, yung board ay responsible sa paggawa ng policy of the corporation, while yung officers naman are in charge sa actual management and pag-execute ng mga policy na yun from the board. Ang acts of corporate officers ay kailangan nasa scope of authority nila in order to be binding. If outside the scope of authority, kailangan i-ratify yung acts or magiging binding siya if the corporation is in a stopel. Yung position of the corporate officers, kailangan nakastate sa bylaws. So immediately pagkatapos ng election of directors, they must organize and elect the officers. Yung term of office may be fixed in the bylaws, or if hindi fixed, they will be elected for 1 year and until ma-elect yung susunod na officers. So yung board ay pwede mag-appoint ng officers or agents, but at the same time, they can also remove them at any time. Ano yung mga positions of the corporate officers? First is the president who must be a director and owns at least 1 share in his name. And hindi naman kailangan na isa siyang Filipino citizen and resident dito sa Philippines. Next is the secretary who may or may not be a director, pero kailangan the secretary is a Filipino citizen and a resident of the Philippines. Next is the treasurer who also may or may not be a director, but unlike the secretary position, he or she may or may not be a Filipino citizen. However, he or she must be a resident of the Philippines. If the corporation is vested with public interest, a compliance officer must be elected. And other officers may also be elected as provided for in the bylaws. One person may have 2 or more positions concurrently, except that one person can't act as a president and secretary at the same time, or as president and treasurer. The reason is that incompatible yung positions with each other, so one person can't hold the same position at the same time. After the election, reports must be submitted to the SEC according to Section 25. The names, nationalities, shareholdings, and residence addresses of the directors or trustees and officers must be submitted within 30 days after the election by the secretary or ng ibang officer. In case there is a failure na mag-elect ng bagong board, a report must be filed with the SEC within 30 days from the date of the scheduled election, and dapat nakastate na din doon kung kailan matutuloy yung election, which shall not be later than 60 days from the supposed election, and notices must be given. The SEC may order an election if walang nakastate na bagong date for the election, or if yung rescheduled election hindi rin natuloy. This will be possible upon the application of a stockholder, member, director, or trustee kapag may nag-notify sa SEC na wala pang nagaganap na election. The SEC will verify na wala ngang natuloy na election and then mag-order na sila to hold an election. Aside from the order to hold an election, the SEC may also have the power to order yung pagbibigay ng notice na may stated time and place of the election that will be held, designated officer, and yung date kung kailan aalamin na kung sino yung mga stockholders or members na pwede bumoto. Regardless of the provisions sa articles or bylaws, yung stockholders or members entitled to vote na nasa meeting na ipinatawag ng SEC lang ang magiging sufficient to form a quorum. Another report that should be submitted is the report that a director, trustee, or officer died, resigned, or anumang dahilan ng pagkawala sa posisyon ng mga elected. Within 7 days from knowledge thereof, the secretary or director, trustee, or officer, or in case of death, yung heirs of the director, trustee, or officer na yon, they must submit the report. The reports are necessary so that those who are dealing or will deal with the corporation will know yung mga important information ng corporation. So that concludes Section 25.
Section 26. Disqualification of directors, trustees, or officers. According to Section 26, no stockholder or member can be elected as a director or trustee if he or she has been convicted by final judgment of an offense carrying an imprisonment exceeding 6 years, or or an offense constituting a violation to the Revised Corporation Code, or in the Republic Act 8799, also known as the Securities Regulation Code, or SRC, in which within 5 years prior to his or her election. We must remember that the disqualification will only apply if the imprisonment exceeds or more than 6 years. But if it is 6 years or below, then you are not disqualified to run in the election of board of directors. Now, another instance wherein you can be disqualified is when you are convicted by an offense on the violation of the Revised Corporation Code, or in the Securities Regulation Code, or SRC. So, if you have been violated any provision in the Revised Corporation Code or in the SRC, then you can be disqualified in the election of director or trustee. The most important qualification is the 5 years prior to your election. What do we mean by this? It means that even if you have been sentenced by an offense with an imprisonment exceeding 6 years, or if you have been violated any provision in the Revised Corporation Code or in the SRC, but the imprisonment or the violation has not been committed 5 years prior to your election, then you are qualified to run for directors or trustee. Also, you can be disqualified if they found out that you are administratively liable for any offense involving fraud acts. Kung meron kang history na kung saan sangkot ka sa kahit anong fraudulent transaction, then or na-prove na you are administratively liable, then you are disqualified to run in the election of the directors or trustee. Lastly, by a foreign court or equivalent foreign regulatory authority, by acts, violation, or misconduct similar to the violations I tackled earlier. So it means that even if you have been committed a crime or any violated acts outside our country, pero kung merong foreign order from foreign court or foreign regulatory authority, then it will constitute a ground for your disqualification. So, hindi necessary na dito lang sa Pilipinas na convict, kundi pwede ka rin makonvict sa ibang bansa. Section 27, Removal of Directors or Trustee. Any director or trustee of a corporation can be removed by a vote of the stockholder representing or holding at least 2/3 of the outstanding capital stock, and for the non-stock corporation, there must be a vote for at least 2/3 or the majority of the members entitled to vote. The said removal should take place either in a general or special meeting called for a purpose. A special meeting of the stockholder for a purpose of removal of director or trustee must be called by the secretary on order of the president, or upon the written demand of the stockholder representing or holding at least the majority of the outstanding capital stock, or the majority of the members entitled to vote. What will happen if there is no secretary? If there is no secretary, or if the secretary failed or refused to call for a meeting or to give a notice, then the stockholder of the corporation will call for a meeting by directly addressing to its stockholders and members. Additional to it, the stockholders must give a notice about the time and location of the said meeting in a way of publication or written notice. You must remember that only the stockholder can remove the director, and the board itself has no power to remove one of its members, since they derive their title from the stockholders, and because of that, the director can only be removed by a power that appointed them. Any director or trustee may be removed with or without cause, even though he or she performs well in the corporation. And that removal without a cause may not be used to deprive minority stockholders or members of the right of representation to which they may be entitled under the Section 23 of the Corporation Code. Sometimes, because of the decision of the majority, they elect director or trustee na kung saan disqualify na pala siya nung una pa lang or may disqualification na nag-arose or na-discover sa kanya later. In that case, the SEC or the Securities and Exchange Commission can complain or motu proprio, meaning on its own initiative or by its own, after due notice, can order a removal of director or trustee who possess disqualification. Lastly, the removal of the disqualified director shall be without prejudice to other sanctions that the SEC may impose on the board of directors or trustee who, with knowledge about the disqualification, or fail to remove those director or trustee. Kaya rin naman na-elect yung mga yun since kahit na aware sila or alam nila na may disqualification na yung taong yun, yet they still elected them. So, according to it, yung mga nag-vote or ito mga aware to that disqualification still elected that disqualified director can also be sanctioned. So, hindi lang yung mga disqualified director or trustee pwedeng matanggal, kundi meron ding sanction against sa mga bumoto, kasabwat or may alam sa disqualification ng disqualified director or trustee. Section 28. Vacancies in the office of directors or trustees. If the vacancy is due to abandonment, death, or resignation, other than removal or expiration of term, then that vacancy may be filled by the vote of at least the majority of the remaining directors, and they must form a quorum. Pero kung bigo sila makabuo ng quorum, then that vacancy can be filled by the stockholders or members in a general or special meeting called for a purpose. Now, if the vacancy is due to expiration of term, the election must be held not later than the day of expiration. On the other hand, if the vacancy is caused by removal, then the election shall be held at the same day of the removal of director or trustee. Ibig sabihin, kung ngayong araw natanggal yung isang director or trustee, ngayong araw din dapat magkakaroon ng election para malaman kung sino yung papalit or pupuno sa pwestong naiwan ng sa pwestong naiwan ng natanggal na director or trustee. The election must be held not later than 45 days from the time the vacancy arose. And that director who is elected must be called as the replacement director, and he or she shall serve only the unexpired portion or term. Ibig sabihin, kung ikaw si replacement director at ang laman mo ang natirang term na lang sa pinalitan mo is 2 days, then you will only serve by 2 days. Kasi yun lang din ang natira sa term niya. When the vacancy prevents the remaining directors to form a quorum, at kung saan nangangailangan na rin magkaroon ng emergency action para maiwasan ng pagkakaroon ng kahit anong loss or damage sa corporation, then that vacancy be temporarily filled from among the officers by anonymous vote, and he or she shall be limited to the emergency action necessary, and the term shall cease within a reasonable time after the termination of emergency or election or upon the election of replacement director. Also, the corporation must notify the Securities and Exchange Commission or SEC within 3 days after the creation of emergency board, stating the reason of the creation of any such emergency board. Lastly, any directorship or trusteeship to be filled by reason of an increase in the number of directors and trustees shall be filled only in the election in a regular or special meeting with the stockholders or members in a duly called purpose, or in the same meeting authorizing the increase in the directors or trustees. So, if there were 5 directors and the stockholder voted or wants to add another director, then it can only be done in the election in a general or special meeting called for a purpose.
Title 3, Section 29. Compensation of Directors and Trustees. In the absence of any provision in the bylaws fixing their compensation, the directors or trustees shall not receive any compensation in their capacity as such, except for reasonable per diems. Per diems, ano nga ba ibig sabihin ng per diems? Meaning nito is an allowance. This is a reasonable allowance. And also, kapag hindi stated sa bylaws yung compensation, walang compensation. Hindi makaka-receive ng compensation si directors or trustees except nga sa reasonable allowances, reasonable per diems. Provided, however, that the stockholders representing at least a majority of the outstanding capital stock or majority of the members may grant directors or trustees with compensation and approve the amount thereof at a regular or special meeting. So, ayun. Pero yung stockholders pala, pwede silang mag-grant ng compensation kahit hindi fixed sa bylaw yung compensation ng directors or trustees. Yung mga stockholders mismo or members, pwedeng mag-grant ng compensation. Pero paano naman kung meron na silang compensation or granted na yung compensation? Gaano kataas yon or may limit ba? Of course, may limit yon. Section 29 also states that in no case shall the total yearly compensation of directors exceed 10% of the net income before income tax of the corporation during the preceding year. So, ito na. Yung compensation is dapat di siya lalampas ng 10% ng total net income ng corporation. Directors or trustees shall not participate in the determination of their own per diems or compensation. Dati, pwede silang mag-participate, but ngayon, sa new corporation code is bawal na. Corporations vested with public interest shall submit to their shareholders and the Commission an annual report of the total compensation of each of their directors or trustees. Title 3, Section 30. Liability of directors, trustees, or officers. Directors or trustees who willfully and knowingly vote for or assent to patently unlawful acts of the corporation or who are guilty of gross negligence or bad faith in directing the affairs of the corporation or acquire any personal or pecuniary interest in conflict with their duty as such directors or trustees shall be liable jointly and severally for all damages resulting therefrom suffered by the corporation, its stockholders, or members, and other persons. So ito, hindi lang sinabi na shall be liable jointly and severally. Hindi porke jointly yung word is joint liability na siya. Remember na may kadugtong pa yon na severally. Jointly and severally. It means it's a solidary obligation. So ano nga ba ulit yung solidary obligation? Solidary obligation is each debtor is liable for the entire obligation, while each creditor is entitled to the entire obligation. Next is a director, trustee, or officer shall not attempt to acquire any interest adverse to the corporation in respect of any matter which has been reposed in them in confidence and upon which equity imposes a disability upon themselves to deal in their own behalf. Otherwise, the said director, trustee, or officer shall be liable as a trustee for the corporation and must account for the profits which otherwise would have accrued to the corporation. So, ano ba ang cases para masabing liable ang directors, trustees, or officers? First is bad faith. It implies a breach of faith and willful failure to respond to plain and well understood obligation. On the other hand naman, gross negligence is the want of even slight care, acting or omitting to act in a situation when there is a duty to act. And based na sa doctrine of corporate veil, kapag na-pierce yung veil, hindi tatargetin yung corporation. Ang tatargetin nito is kung sino yung liable. Either yung directors, yung trustees, or yung officers, and yung separate juridical personality ng corporation and ng directors or officers or trustees is hindi na yun mapapansin. Title 3, Section 31. Dealings of directors, trustees, or officers with the corporation. So, sinabi na with the corporation. Meaning, it involves the corporation and the directors, trustees, and officers and the transaction between them. So, pag ganon, yung situation, ano yung governing rule? Of course, yun yung Section 31. A contract of the corporation with one or more its directors, trustees, officers, or their spouses and relatives within the fourth civil degree of consanguinity or affinity is voidable. So, voidable. Remember, voidable siya. Ibig sabihin, it can be ratified later on. Hindi siya void, pero it is voidable. At the option of such corporation, unless all the following conditions are present. First, the letter A, the presence of such director or trustee in the board meeting in which the contract was approved was not necessary to constitute a quorum for such meeting. Ibig sabihin, 10 directors, 7 sila sa meeting, and yung isa doon dealing director, so kahit wala siya doon, quorum pa rin kahit wala siya doon. Kung 7 sila tapos wala siya, meron pang 6. Letter B, the vote of such director or trustee was not necessary for the approval of the contract. Third, letter C, the contract is fair and reasonable under the circumstances. Fourth, the letter D, in case of corporations vested with public interest, material contracts are approved by at least 2/3 of the entire membership of the board with at least a majority of the independent directors voting to approve the material contract. And letter E, in by case the board of an officer or directors, the contract has been previously authorized. Where any of the first 3 conditions set forth in the preceding paragraph is absent, in the case of a contract with a director or trustee, such contract may be ratified by the vote of the stockholders representing at least 2/3 of the outstanding capital stock or of at least 2/3 of the members in a meeting called for the purpose, provided that full disclosure of the adverse interest of the directors or trustees involved is made at such meeting and the contract is fair and reasonable under the circumstances. So, pag present naman yung mga conditions na yon, then the contract is good. Kasi pag hindi present yung conditions, ibig sabihin, voidable yung contract. Hindi pwedeng magkaroon ng absence sa following conditions kasi it says na all the following conditions. The word all itself explained it. And kapag ang first 3 conditions, yung ABC, are absent, voidable na talaga yung contract. Voidable na siya. Isang absent pa lang nga, voidable na. Paano pa kaya kung 3? So, it's a big no para sa absent sa mga conditions.
I am Cages Ann Casil, the reporter for Section 32. Section 32, contracts between corporation with interlocking directors. Except in cases of fraud and provided the contract is fair and reasonable under the circumstances, a contract between 2 or more corporations having interlocking directors shall not be invalidated on that ground alone, provided that if the interest of interlocking director is one corporation is substantial and interest in the other corporation or corporations is merely nominal, the contract shall be subject to the provision of the preceding section insofar as the latter corporation or corporations are concerned. Stockholding exceeding 20% of the outstanding capital stock shall be considered substantial for purposes of interlocking directors. In first paragraph, where any of the first three conditions set for in the preceding paragraph is absent in case of the contract with the director or trustees, such contract may be ratified by the vote of the stockholders representing at least 2/3 of the standing capital stock. So, pwede pa rin maging perfectly valid yung contract kahit na di na-meet yung any of the three conditions once na na-ratify or making it officially by the vote of the stockholders. If the interest of interacting director in the one corporation is substantial and the other corporation is merely nominal, the contract shall be subject to provisions of preceding section insofar as the latter corporation are concerned. So, ano yung tinatukoy na latter? Latter corporation, it means the corporation that the director of have nominal interest. So, what will happen in that preceding section is mag-apply. So, what is the preceding section? Yung preceding section about self-dealing directors. So, interlocking directors, these are the members of the board of directors in a certain corporations who are also directors in other corporations. Interlocking directors is the director who simultaneously serve on the boards of two or more corporations and deal with each other or have allied interests. For general rule, a contract between two or more corporations having interlocking directors shall not be invalidated. To put it simple, siya ay director ng different corporation. For example, I am a director of Corporation A and also a director of Corporation B. And there is no problem with that as long as you have money or pera na pambili ng shares and baka ma-elect ka pa as director. And that kind of director is called interlocking director. For requisites, the contract is not fraudulent and the contract is fair and reasonable under the circumstances. So, what is substantial interest? Stock holdings exceeding 20% of the outstanding capital stock shall be considered substantial for other purposes of interlocking directors. 33. Disloyalty of a director, where a director by virtue of such office acquires a business opportunity which should belong to the corporation, thereby obtaining profits to the prejudice of such corporation, the director must account for a refund to the latter all such profits. So here also, it applies the doctrine of corporate opportunity. It means na ang director acquired a business opportunity that should belong to the corporation. He must account to the corporation for all the profits he obtained. Under Section 33 also, the guilty director will be only exempt from the liability to the corporation to account the profit realized of his disloyal act is ratified by the vote of stockholders representing at least 2/3 of the standing capital. This provision shall be applicable notwithstanding the fact that the director risked one's own funds in the venture. So, what is the doctrine of corporate opportunity? A director, by virtue of his office, acquires for himself a business opportunity which should belong to the corporation, thereby obtaining profits to the prejudice of such corporation. He must account the latter all such profits by refunding the same. Ratification by the stockholders is the act of the director violating the doctrine of corporate opportunity can be ratified by the vote of stockholders. Syempre, owning by the representing at least 2/3 of the stock, of capital stock. For Section 34, executive management and other special committees. So, what is executive committee? So, there are chances kasi na mahirap magtawag ng meeting or may chances na hindi naabot yung quorum para makagawa ng isang valid corporate act. So, what they do is they create an executive committee. So, this executive committee, pwedeng sila ang mag-meet and sila na din ang mag-decide. So, in this section, it states if the bylaws so provide, the board may create an executive committee composed of at least 3 directors. It said committee may act by majority vote of all its members on such specific matters within the competence of the board as may be delegated to it in the bylaws or by majority vote of the board except with the respect of the following. So, eto yung mga hindi nila pwedeng pag-decidean alone. So, for the other corporate act, pwedeng executive committees na lang. Pero except sa mga ito. 1. Approval of any action for which shareholders' approval is also required. Filling a vacancy in the board, amended or repeal of bylaws, or the adaptation of new bylaws, amendment or repeal of any resolution of the board which by its express terms is not amendable or repealable. Distribution of cash dividends to the shareholders. So this is the matters which are not within the competence of the executive committees. Also, it is stated that the board of directors may now create special committees of temporary or permanent nature and determine the members' term, composition, powers, and responsibilities. Example dito is mga audit committee, nomination committee, and compensation committee. So, quorum required of the executive committee is the committee may act by majority vote of all its members on such specific matters only within the competence of the board.
Good day everyone! We will discuss the Title 4 of the Revised Corporation Code of the Philippines, which is about the powers of corporation. We all know that a corporation has no power except those expressly conferred upon by the Corporation Code and those implied or incidental to its existence. Since a corporation is just an artificial being, it exercises its powers through its board of directors and duly authorized officers and agents.
According to Section 35 or the Corporate Powers and Capacity, every corporation incorporated under this code has the power and capacity to sue and be sued in its corporate name, to have perpetual existence, to adopt and use a corporate seal, to amend its articles of incorporation, to adopt bylaws, to sell stocks, to transact real and personal property, to enter into a partnership, to make reasonable donations, to establish pensions, and to exercise such other powers as may be essential or necessary to carry out its purpose or purposes as stated in the Articles of Incorporation.
So these powers of corporation refers to the right or capacity of a corporation to perform all acts or things but with limitations by the law and included in the Articles of Incorporation. There are 3 classifications of corporate powers: those expressly granted or authorized by the law, those necessary to carry out the purpose of the corporation, and those incidental to its existence. So what is express powers? These are the powers expressly conferred upon the Corporation Code, and these powers can be ascertained from, first, special law creating the corporation, which is usually a GOCC like GSIS, where the legislative create its special law as their special charter. Second, in case of the corporation is formed under the General Incorporation, which is the revised Corporation Code of the Philippines here, the general law of the land is applicable to the corporation and its articles of incorporation. Basically, express powers are powers expressly given to a corporation under the General Incorporation, while implied powers are powers which are reasonably necessary to accomplish or carry out the purpose for which the corporation was formed. Remember that the action must be reasonably necessary or essential to classify it as implied powers. Some examples are acts of borrowing money, making ordinary contracts, executing checks, bills, promissory note, etc., which is all under the ordinary circumstances in order to run a business. Incidental or inherent powers are powers which a corporation can exercise by the mere fact of its being a corporation. It's necessary to the existence of a corporation, so it's impliedly granted. By the mere fact that the corporation has corporate existence, kahit hindi expressly granted, the corporation can still exercise an act. The difference between implied and incidental powers are, implied powers are necessary or essential to execute and express powers, while incidental powers, corporation can still exercise an act by the mere fact that the corporation has corporate existence. For example, power of succession, to sue and be sued, to have a corporate name, and to use a corporate seal. In powers of a corporation to sue, there is a derivative suit where the stockholders, on behalf of the corporations, enforces corporate rights against the corporation's directors, even though that the corporation's directors have the right whether or not the corporation should sue. They will never be willing to sue themselves or impugn their wrongful decisions. That's why under the bylaws, stockholders are permitted to bring an actions in the name of the corporations to hold the corporation's directors accountable.
Extend or shorten corporate term. A private corporation may extend or shorten its term as stated in the Articles of Incorporation when approved by a majority vote of the Board of Directors or Trustees and ratified at the meeting by the stockholders or members representing at least two-thirds of the outstanding capital stock or of its member. Written notice of the proposed action and the time and place of the meeting shall be sent to the stockholders or members at their respective place of residence as shown in the books of the corporation and must be deposited to the addressee in the post office with posted prepaid served personally when allowed in the bylaws or done with the consent of the stockholder. Sent electronically in accordance with the rules and regulations of the Commission on the use of electronic data message. In case of extension of corporate term, a dissenting stockholder may exercise the right of appraisal under condition provided in the code. The explanation, Section 36, power to extend or shorten the corporate term. It stated that a private corporation may extended or shorten its term kapag approve ito ng board directors or mga shareholders member na may hawak ng at least two-thirds of outstanding capital stock. So, the written proposal action are need to be sent by their address through post office or send it personally. Shareholder has an appraisal right, meaning that a shareholder who dissented and not agree to the proposed action can leave the corporation by demanding payment of fair market value of his share. So, yung pag mag-extend ka ng corporation, hawak ang desisyon ng board of directors or shareholders. Sa kanila nakasalalay yung term ng isang corporation. Sa shareholders lang, merong appraisal right. Pag pwede silang magbayad, pag hindi sila nag-agree do sa proposal action na nangyayari sa corporation nila.
Section 37. Power to increase or decrease capital stock, incur, create, or increase bonded indebtedness, This section prescribes the procedure to be complied with to effect a legal increase or decrease of the capital stock, which is now subject to prior approval of the Securities and Exchange Commission. A corporate bond is an obligation to pay a definite sum of money at a future time at fixed rate of interest. Things to keep in mind about this section. 1. This applies to stock and non-stock corporation. So a business corporation, in the absence of restriction, may borrow money whenever the necessity of its business requires and issue security or customary evidence of debt, such as notes, bonds, or mortgages. Number 2, procedures and formalities. The procedure prescribed in this section for incurring bonded indebtedness is the same as the procedure for increasing or decreasing the capital stock, except that the certificate needs to state the matters set forth. 3. Shares and members entitled to vote. So even holders of non-voting shares or non-voting members, as this case may be, are entitled to vote on the matter. Number 4, any incurring, creating, or increasing by the corporation of any bonded indebtedness is always subject to prior approval of the Securities and Exchange Commission. Now, there are also limitations to this power. As a general rule, a corporation cannot lawfully decrease its capital stock if such decrease will have the effect of relieving existing subscribers from the obligation of paying for their unpaid subscriptions, without valuable consideration for such release. As such, an act of the corporation constitutes an attempted withdrawal of so much capital upon which corporate creditors are entitled to rely. So it must not prejudice the rights of the creditors. 2. A corporation cannot issue stock in excess of the amount limited by its articles of incorporation. Such issue is ultra vires or beyond powers, and the stock issued is voided even in the hands of a bona fide purchaser for value. 3. A reduction or increase of the capital stock can take place only in the manner and under the conditions prescribed by law. The Corporation Code contains no prohibition for a corporation to increase its authorized capital stocks even if the same has not yet been fully subscribed. Now, why do we increase capital stock? 1. Increase of the corporate assets. An increase of the amount of the capital stock may be for the purpose of affecting an increase in the corporate assets by authorizing A. The creation of new shares to be offered and issued at a fixed valuation, or the increase of the par value shares authorized to be issued. Number 2, issuance of stock dividends. So the capital stock may also be increased without any corresponding increase in the corporate assets by the issuance of stock dividends. Ways of increasing authorized capital stock. 1. By increasing the number of shares authorized to be issued without increasing the par value thereof. 2. By increasing the par value of each share without increasing the number thereof. And 3. By increasing both the number of shares authorized to be issued and the par value thereof. Section 38. Power to deny preemptive right. Whenever the capital stock of a corporation is increased and new shares of stock are issued, the new issue must be offered first to the stockholders who are such at that time. Increase was made in proportion to their existing shareholdings and on equal terms with other holders of the original stocks before subscriptions are received by the general public. For example, so if a stockholder with preemptive right owns 20% of the outstanding shares of the corporation, he may subscribe 20% of any shares of stock issued by the corporation. The reason for the grant of right. So this rule aims to safeguard the right of a stockholder to preserve unaltered and unimpaired proportionate influence and interest in the corporation and the relative value of his holdings. So in other words, the purpose of the right is to protect impairment and dilution the basic rights of the existing stockholders in the corporation. Example would be to voting control, to dividend payments, and to the net assets of the corporation.
Republic Act 10667, also known as Philippine Competition Act, state that a corporation, as long as majority of its board director or trustee may sell, lease, exchange, mortgage, etc. their property and assets with such forms of condition, the vote shall always be two-thirds of the property or the two-thirds of the
Section 40, so power to acquire own shares. This section expressly authorizes a stock corporation to purchase or acquire its own shares subject to the limitation that the acquisition is for a legitimate corporate purposes and that there be unrestricted retained earnings in its books to cover the share as acquired. Elimination of fractional shares. A fractional share is a share which is less than one corporation share, meaning if a stockholder owns 250 shares and the corporation declares 25% stock dividend, his total shares will be 312 and one half shares. Inasmuch as fractional shares cannot be represented at corporate meetings, the corporation may purchase the same from the stockholder concerned or issue fractional scrip certificates to such stockholder who may negotiate for the sale thereof with other stockholders also owning fractional shares so as to convert them into full shares. Satisfaction of indebtedness to corporation. Number 2 of Section 4D does not authorize a corporation to arbitrarily purchase the shares it issued to any of its stockholders indebted to it, whether at the prevailing market price or at par value for the purpose of applying the proceeds thereof to the satisfaction of its claim against them. And this is particularly true where the consent of such stockholders has not been secured. And even their consent has been secured, the corporation can buy their shares only if the conditions for the purchase are present. A stockholder may avail of Section 63, which allows transfer of shares to a third party. payment of shares of dissenting or withdrawing stockholders. Number 3 of Section 40 refers to instances when a dissenting stockholder is given appraisal right and the right to withdraw from the corporation as provided in this code. Conditions for the exercise of the power. So the right and power of a corporation to acquire or purchase its own shares is not absolute, but it always depends upon the contingency of the condition of its affairs and its relation to creditors at the time of the purchase. Briefly, a corporation's right to purchase its shares according to the weight of authority is subject to the following limitation. One, that its capital is not thereby impaired. Two, that it be for a legitimate and proper corporate purpose. Three, that there shall be unrestricted retained earnings to purchase the same and its capital is not thereby impaired. Four, that the corporation acts in good faith and without prejudice to the rights of creditors and stockholders. Five, that the conditions of corporate affairs warrant it.
Section 41 talks about the power to invest corporate funds in another corporation or business or for any other purpose. Subject to the provisions of this code, a private corporation may invest its funds in other corporation, business, or for any other purpose other than the primary purpose for which it was organized. When approved by a majority of the board of directors or trustees and ratified by the stockholders, representing at least two-thirds of the outstanding capital stock or by at least two-thirds of the members in the case of non-stock corporation at a meeting duly called for the purpose. A corporation has no right to open or operate another form of business that is different from its purpose. But with this power, a corporation can invest into another form of business. So basically, bawal mag-open, mag-operate for investment only, but it must be ratified and approved by the board of directors and stockholders. Notice of the proposed investment and the time and place of the meeting shall be addressed to each stockholders or member at the place of residence as shown in the books of the corporation and deposited to the addressee in the post office with postage prepaid, served personally or sent electronically in accordance with the rules and regulations of the commissions on the use of electronic data message when allowed by the bylaws or done with the consent of the stockholders. This is just about the proper and complete notice that will be sent to stockholders about the proposed investment. Provided that any dissenting stockholders shall have appraisal right as provided in this code. Provided, however, that where the investment by the corporation is reasonably necessary to accomplish its primary purpose, as stated in the Articles of Incorporation, the approval of the stockholders or members shall not be necessary.
So here are the requisites to accomplish its primary purpose. First, approval of the majority of the board of directors or trustees and the approval of the stockholders or members shall not be necessary. Let's say, investment corporation. Yung primary purpose nila is to invest. So, hindi na nila need ng approval ng mga stockholders since the corporation is doing its primary purpose. Kakailanganin lang yung approval nila if the corporation is doing that is not related to their primary purpose. And having said that, these are the requisites in accomplishing a purpose other than those primary purpose. First, approval of the majority of the board of directors or trustees and ratification by the stockholders representing at least two-thirds of the outstanding capital stock or by at least two-thirds of the members in the case of non-stock corporations at a stockholders or members meeting duly called for the purpose. Written notice of the proposed investment and the time and place shall be addressed to each stockholders or member by mail or served personally or sent electronically or in accordance with the rules and regulations of the Commission. The use of electronic data message when allowed by the bylaws or done with the consent of the stockholders. Any dissenting stockholder shall have appraisal right and the ratification must be made at a stockholders or members meeting duly called for the purpose. So if The primary purpose is in question need na ng approval ng stockholders and it must be ratified by at least 2/3 of outstanding capital stock in case of stock corporation and at least 2/3 in case of non-stock corporation.
Next is Section 42. This talks about the power of a corporation to declare dividends. This just applies to stock corporation since non-stock corporation has no right to declare dividends. The board of directors of a stock corporation may declare dividends out of the unrestricted retained earnings which shall be payable in cash, property, or in stock to all stockholders on the basis of outstanding stocks held by them. So basically, the outstanding capital stock will be the basis of dividends, provided that any cash dividends due on delinquent stock shall first be applied to the unpaid balance on the subscription plus costs and expenses, while stock dividends shall be withheld from the delinquent stockholders until their unpaid subscription is fully paid. So we can see in this situation that there are two forms, cash and stock dividends. When there are delinquent stock or unpaid subscription, we can apply the cash dividends for the delinquency, including the costs and expenses, while stock dividends will be withheld. Hindi yun i-distribute hanggat hindi pa nababayaran yung unpaid subscription. Provided further that no stock dividend shall be issued without the approval of stockholder representing at least 2/3 of the outstanding capital stock at a regular or special meeting duly called for the purpose. Yung approval is important in stock dividends. Stock corporations are prohibited from retaining surplus profit in excess of 100% of their paid-in capital stock. Paid-in capital stock ay yung binabayad ng mga stockholders to acquire shares. And when the returning surplus profit is more than 100% of the paid-in capital, the corporation is required to declare dividends. For example, 500,000 yung paid-in capital and 600,000 na yung retaining surplus profit. So by that, the corporation is required to declare dividends. The corporation can still decide whether or not they will declare dividends. Here are the exceptions. First, when justified by definite corporate expansions, projects, or programs approved by the board of directors. Pwedeng may investment, expansions, or projects na gagastusan yung corporation and gagamitin yung dividends para dito and not declare dividends. When the corporation is prohibited under any loan agreement with financial institution or creditors, whether local or foreign, from declaring dividends without their consent and such consent has not yet been secured, or when it can be clearly shown that such retention is necessary under special circumstances obtaining in the corporation, such as when there is need for special reserve for probable contingencies. So what is dividends? Dividends is a corporate profit set aside, declared, and ordered to be paid by the directors for the distribution among stockholders at a fixed time. We all know that a stock corporation exists to make a profit and to distribute that portion of profit to its stockholders, and that portion is called dividends, which is being set aside by the board of directors to be paid ratably to its stockholders on a fixed time. Retained earnings. Retained earnings is the accumulated profits realized out of normal and continuous operations of the business after deducting therefore distribution to stockholders and transfer to capital or other accounts. Unrestricted retained earnings. The retained earnings which have not been reserved or set aside by the board of directors for some corporate purpose. So yung retained earnings is the difference between the total present value of the corporate asset after deducting all the losses and liabilities and amount of outstanding capital stock. And that retained earnings can be in two types. The restricted retained earnings na hindi pwedeng i-distribute sa mga stockholders as a dividend, and yung unrestricted retained earnings na isang uri ng retained earnings na tinabi ng mga board of directors for other corporate purpose, like for the distribution of dividends. Declaration of dividends. Board of Directors of a stock corporation has the power to declare dividends out of the unrestricted retained earnings which shall be payable in cash, in property, or in stock to all stockholders on the basis of the outstanding shares held by them. Pwedeng mag-declare ng dividends ang isang corporation kapag meron ng unrestricted retained earnings. And that dividends can be in three forms: cash, property, or in stock dividends. The distribution of dividends must be pro rata or proportional to the shares they hold. Declaration of dividends ordinarily requires the concurrence of two things. First, unrestricted retained earnings must be exist. Second, a corporate resolution from the board declaring the payment of dividends from a portion or all in such earnings to stockholders. And tandaan na in cash dividends, it only requires the approval of board of directors. While in stock dividends, it requires a resolution from the board of directors and approval of that resolution from stakeholders.
Section 43. To power to enter into management contract. No corporation shall conclude a management contract with another corporation unless such contract is approved by the board of directors and by stockholders owning at least the majority of the outstanding capital stock, or by the list of the majority of the members in the case of non-stock corporation of both the managing and the managed corporation at a meeting duly called for the purpose. Di ba sinabi na ang title ng Section 43 is Power to Management Contract. Management contract, it means that in one corporation, nagle-lend siya ng services to manage one corporation. It defined here na walang corporation na pwede mag-manage ng isa pang corporation unless inapprove ng board of directors and stockholder yung majority. There have two cases here. Yung management corporation and managing corporation. Management corporation is the one who manage the managing corporation. Kung ang stockholder is nag-own siya ng more than 1/3 sa both corporation like managing corporation and management corporation, magkakaroon ng changes sa voting requirements. If yung term is naka-base sa managing corporation, for example, yung contract naka-base sa managing corporation, the voting requirement is hindi mag-iiba. Nakasalalay pa rin siya or naka-base pa rin siya sa board of directors and stockholder do sa majority na inapprove ng board of directors and stockholders. While sa management corporation, ang majority voting requirements here is 2/3.
Next is Section 44. Section 44 talks about the ultra vires acts of corporation. No corporation shall possess or exercise corporate powers other than those conferred by this code or by its articles of incorporation and except as necessary or incidental to the exercise of the powers conferred. Corporations are permitted to exercise its powers expressly conferred upon by this corporation code and implied or incidental to do what is reasonably necessary for the corporation. An ultra vires act is not expressly or impliedly necessary or incidental powers of a corporation. It's an act which is not forbidden but impliedly forbidden. Basically, it's an invalid act. It's beyond the purpose and powers of a corporation.
Good evening, everyone. I am Marcel Brandon Malinaw, and tonight I will be discussing the Title 5 of the Revised Corporation Code of the Philippines, which is about bylaws. So this will going to be a short discussion since this title has only 3 sections lang naman. It is for the adoption, for the content, and for the amendment of the bylaws. But before we proceed with those sections, let me first discuss the nature of the bylaws. So ano nga ba muna yung tinatawag nating bylaws? Next slide. Sabi dito, bylaws signifies the rules and regulations or private laws enacted by the corporation to regulate, govern, and control its own actions, affairs, and concerns and its stockholders or members and directors and officers with relation thereto, and among themselves in their relation to it. So, tandaan lang natin na yung bylaws, it is just a private law that are enacted by the corporation. In other words, these are those continuing rules that are adopted by the corporation for its own government only, and that of the individuals composing the corporation having direction with its affairs, either in whole or even just in part, no, with the management and control of its affairs and activities. Pero ano nga ba yung purpose? Bakit meron tayong bylaw? Ayan, sabi dito, the purpose of a bylaw is to regulate the conduct and define the duties of the members towards the corporation and among themselves. So, para ma-emphasize natin, it is to regulate the conduct and define the duties of the members towards lang dun sa corporation and among themselves. Bakit? Kasi yung bylaws, it is only self-imposed. Although, it is adopted with related statutory authority, bylaws do not have status as public law since self-imposed nga siya. So, yun yung purpose ng bylaws natin. Ngayon, let's proceed with the discussion sa adoption of bylaws, which is Section 45 of the Revised Corporation Code of the Philippines. Ayan, Section 45, the adoption of bylaws. So, ano nga ba muna yung adoption? When we say adoption, it is the act of adopting. When we say adopting naman, it is you are accepting formally and put it into effect. So you are putting the bylaws into effect after you have accepted it. So, yung Section 45 kasi, mahaba yung provisions niya. Meron siyang 4 na paragraphs. So, ang ginawa ko, I divided it into 2 paragraphs na lang muna, then mamaya na yung other 2. So, dito, sa first 2 paragraphs, ito yung sinasabi. For the adoption of bylaws by the corporation, the affirmative vote, ito yung requisites, affirmative vote of the stockholders representing the majority of the outstanding capital stock or of at least the majority of the members kapag non-stock yung corporation shall be necessary. Ikalawa, the bylaws shall be signed by the stockholders or members voting for them and shall be kept in the principal office subject to the inspection of the stockholders or members during office hours. Notwithstanding the provisions of the preceding paragraph, bylaws may be adopted and filed prior to incorporation, and in such case, the bylaws shall be approved and signed by all the incorporators and submitted to the Commission together with the Articles of Incorporation. So ano lang ba yung sinasabi dito? Next slide. Ito lang yung explanation dun sa mahabang paragraph, yung 2 paragraphs na yun. When you are adopting a bylaws, there are 2 ways you can adopt it. Una, pwede kang mag-adopt ng bylaws before incorporation or yung tinatawag nating pre-incorporation. And ikalawa, pwede kang mag-adopt ng bylaws after incorporation or yung tinatawag nating post-incorporation. When normally, yung after incorporation yung ginagawa ng mga corporation natin. And kapag post-incorporation yung napili mo kapag mag-a-adopt ka ng bylaws, ang kailangan mo is yung first paragraph ng Section 45, which is the affirmative vote of the stockholders representing at least the majority of the outstanding capital stock or of at least the majority of members kapag non-stock nga, yun yung kailangan. And ikalawa, it shall be signed by the stockholders or members voting for them. Ngayon, kapag mag-a-adopt ka ng bylaws before incorporation or pre-incorporation, ang kailangan mo naman is yung pirma and approval ng all or ng lahat ng incorporators, and it will be filed with the SEC kasabay ng Articles of Incorporation. Ngayon, ano nga ba yung Articles of Incorporation? Bakit pa ba tayo magpa-file ng bylaws kung meron na naman tayong Articles of Incorporation? Ayan, so ito yung table na nagdi-differentiate between Articles of Incorporation and bylaws. Sabi dun sa una, yung Articles of Incorporation, it is a condition precedent in the acquisition of corporate existence, while yung bylaws, it is a condition subsequent. kung maaalala nyo sa accounting natin, meron tayong initial measurement and subsequent measurement. So, ganun din dito, para magkaroon ng corporate existence ang isang corporation, yung initial na measurement na tinutukoy ko dito ay yung precedent na condition, which is the Articles of Incorporation. Ngayon, yung Articles of Incorporation, susundan siya ng bylaws kasi yung bylaws, it is a condition subsequent. Then, anong mangyayari kapag nakapag-file sila ng bylaws? Then, magkakaroon ng perfect corporate personality yung isang corporation. So, magkaiba pa rin yung purpose ng bylaws and ng Articles of Incorporation. Next one, yung Articles of Incorporation, it constitutes the charter or fundamental law of the corporation, while yung bylaws, it is the rules and regulations that were only adopted by the corporation. Pangatlo, yung Articles of Incorporation, it must be executed before incorporation. However, yung bylaws kasi, it may be executed before or after the incorporation. So next, kapag nag-a-amend tayo, when we say amend, change or modifying something, especially kapag merong correction. So, yung Articles of Incorporation is amended by a majority of the Board of Directors or Trustees representing 2/3 of the capital stock or 2/3 of the members kapag non-stock yung corporation. Yung bylaws naman, it is amended by a majority vote of the Board of Directors and majority vote of outstanding capital stock or majority of the members kapag non-stock yung corporation. So, magkaiba pa rin yung majority dun sa 2/3 na required sa Articles of Incorporation. Next one, sa Articles of Incorporation kasi, the power to amend or repeal the Articles of Incorporation cannot be delegated. So, the Board of Directors cannot entrust the repealment or the amendment ng Articles of Incorporation sa stockholders or members. Sa bylaws kasi, the power to amend or repeal bylaws or adopt new bylaws may be delegated, pwedeng ipasa or pwedeng gawin ng 2/3 of the outstanding capital stock or 2/3 of the members in case of non-stock corporation. Ngayon, paano naman ba nagiging valid or ano ba yung mga kailangan para maging valid yung bylaws? Ito yung listahan that are considered as the elements of the valid bylaws. Yung una, tsaka yung pangalawa, parang siyang elements ng valid contract na it must not be contrary to law, morals, good customs, public order, and public policy. However, dinagdag dun sa una, sa letter A, na dapat hindi siya inconsistent with the code. Yung pangatlo, they must not impair obligation of contracts. Ano lang ba yung mga ka-impair doon? Back in our taxation subject, yung police power kasi yun yung most superior. Ikaapat, they must not or they must be pala general and uniform in their operation and not directed against particular individuals. In other words, it must not be discriminatory. Ikalima, they must be consistent with the Charter of Articles of Incorporation. The bylaws cannot have rules that are inconsistent with the code and in the Articles of Incorporation. So, dapat according pa rin doon. Naka-consistent pa rin siya or consistent pa rin siya dun sa Articles of Incorporation. Lastly, they must be reasonable. Ayan, so ito na yung next two paragraphs ng Section 45. Una, sabi dito, in all cases, bylaws shall be effective only upon the issuance of the commission of a certification that the bylaws are in accordance with the revised corporation code. Yung commission shall not accepted for filing the bylaws generally. The commission cannot accept the filing of the bylaws or any amendment thereto to any bank, banking institution, building, educational institution, insurance company, and other special corporations that are governed by special laws. Unless, ito yung exception, kapag these special corporations are accompanied by a certificate of the appropriate government agency to the effect that such bylaws or amendments are in accordance with the law. So, sinabi dito sa third paragraph, kailan ba nagiging effective yung bylaws? Ang sagot, upon the issuance, kapag nag-issue na ng certificate yung Secretary and Exchange Commission or yung SEC na yung bylaws are in accordance with the revised corporation code. Ngayon, sino-sino lang ba yung sakop ng bylaws? As to directors or trustees, officers, and stockholders or members, they are bound and need to comply with the bylaws because they are presumed to know the provisions of it. So they cannot say that they do not know the laws or the bylaws of the corporation kasi they are part of the corporation. They are corporators of it. Pero ngayon, ang tanong, yung third persons ba bound sila into bylaws? Generally, no. Third persons are not bound unless, yung exception natin, kapag meron silang knowledge ng bylaws either actually or constructively. Now, let's proceed with Section 46, the contents of the bylaws. Ayan, so Section 46 covers the contents of the bylaws. So, merong 11 na nilista yung Section 46 kung ano nga ba yung dapat or kung ano ba yung pwedeng maging laman ng bylaws ng isang corporation. Sabi dito, a private corporation may provide, not shall provide. So, depende pa rin sa corporation kung ano yung ilalagay nila sa bylaws nila. The following in its bylaws. Yung una, the time, place, and manner of calling and conducting regular or special meetings of the directors or trustees. Ikalawa, ganun din pero din naman siya sa stockholders or members. Ikatlo, yung required quorum. Ano ba yung quorum? Ito yung minimum number na required para maging valid yung election. Pero dito kasi sa Revised Corporation Code, yung quorum na tinutukoy is yung majority ng incorporators. Ibig sabihin, majority, 50% plus 1 ng incorporators that are fixed in the Articles of Incorporation. So, the required quorum in meetings of stockholders or members and the manner of voting them. Yung bylaws din, pwede niyang mas taasan pa. Pwede niyang gawin na mas mataas pa yung majority. Pwedeng 75%, hindi lang 51%. Yung quorum sa isang meetings. Ikaapat, the modes by which a stockholder, member, director, or trustee may attend meetings and cast their votes. Kung pwede ba online, kung pwede bang video calls, ganun. Ikalima, the form of proxies or stockholders and members and the manner of voting them. Ika-anim, the directors or trustees' qualifications, duties, and responsibilities, the guidelines for setting the compensation of directors or trustees and officers, and the maximum number of the board representations that an independent director or trustee may have, which shall in no case be more than the number prescribed by the Commission. Ikapito, the bylaws may also provide the time for holding the annual election of directors or trustees and the mode of manner of giving notice thereof. Ikawalo, the manner of election or appointment and the term of office of all officers other than directors or trustees. Next, pwede rin i-provide ng bylaws yung penalties sa violation ng bylaws. Ikasampu, in the case of stock corporations, bylaws may provide for the manner of issuing stock certificates. Lastly, such other matters as may be necessary for the proper or convenient transaction of its corporate affairs for the promotion of good governance and anti-graft and corruption measures. Ngayon, sabi dito, arbitration agreement may be provided in the bylaws pursuant to the Section 181 of this code. In Section 181, it is the arbitration of the corporations. So, let's proceed with Section 47. And in Section 47, it is about the amendment of bylaws. Ayan. Section 47, the last section of this title, is for the amendment of the bylaws. Kapag amendment, sabi ko kanina, you are changing or modifying something lalo na kapag may correction. So, sabi sa Section 47, So the bylaws may be amended by the majority of the board of directors or trustees and the owners of at least a majority of the outstanding capital stock or at least a majority of the members of a non-stock corporation at a regular or special meeting duly called for the purpose may amend or repeal the bylaws or adopt new bylaws. Yung owners of 2/3 ng outstanding capital stock or 2/3 ng members kapag non-stock yung corporation may delegate to the board of directors or trustees the power to amend or repeal the bylaws or adopt new bylaws. So, ito yung isang kaibahan ng bylaws sa Articles of Incorporation, di ba? Nasabi ko kanina. So, provided nga lang na yung any power delegated by the board of directors or trustees to amend or repeal the bylaws or adopt new bylaws shall be considered as revoked whenever the stockholders owning or representing a majority of the outstanding capital stock or majority of the members shall so vote at a regular or special meeting. Ngayon, anong mangyayari kapag mag-a-amend ng isang bylaws? Under din ng Section 47, whenever the bylaws are amended or new bylaws are adopted, the corporation shall file with the commission such amended and new bylaws and, kapag applicable, the stockholders or members' resolution authorizing the delegation of the power to amend and or adopt new bylaws duly certified under oath by the corporate secretary and the majority of directors or trustees. Ngayon, kailan magiging effective yung na-amend na bylaws? So, the last paragraph of Section 47, the amended or new bylaws shall only be effective kapag nag-issue na uli yung SEC ng certification na yung amended bylaws are same or in accordance pa rin with the revised corporation code and other relevant laws. Ayan, so dito na po nagtatapos yung report ko under ng Title 5 ng Revised Corporation Code and I hope may natutunan kayo and salamat ng sobra sa pakikinig sa akin. Once again, thank you and good night everyone.